Hello. All right. And so here we are. We're working on the constitutional assignment this time. All right. And so this is it's gonna be different in that it's not set up in the argumentative narrative fashion, right? That you're accustomed to now. Instead, you're simply going to look through the original Constitution, and I'm going to ask you to put um, you're going to make three categories, okay? Three categories, and you're going to put things under one of those three. You do not have to address every single section of all the articles. That's exhaustive. That's too much. All right. So I have all five of your names, but instead, right? All I ask. Let's see here. So you see here, please make three lists or categories, and please cite at least four examples of each, okay, from the subsequently presented Constitution. Make sure that at least one section from one article, okay, is present in any of the three categories. So, for instance, right, you have you look at the Constitution; it's in the back of your textbook, all right, regardless of what edition you have or what volume. And then also it's here. I have it right here. So notice, right, you have the preamble, and then it gets into Article 1. Article 1 pertains to the legislator, the known as Congress, right? The national body that makes the laws. Then Article 2 is the executive with the president and his or her cabinet and vice president, right? There you have Article 2 and several sections therein. And then you have also Article 3 on the judiciary, right? The Supreme Court, and some opening phrases about wiggle room for future generations in composing, quote, lesser courts. So just of those first three, right? I ask that you simply at least, right, um, put put something from one of those three articles in one of these three categories. So I don't feel like I'm asking too much, and to the extent that I'm asking you to put something under each article, under each of the three categories, etc. And overall, I just ask that you at least put about four, at least put four examples under each category. So the categories, right? Enlightened. Okay, so obviously I use that adjective a little bit more loosely than just simply adhering to the Enlightenment, but of course it's tied to it. And the notion, right, that in the early modern era, that the vestiges of what was left of the medieval time period and the medieval codes of governing, etc., that they were becoming obsolete. They were becoming archaic, right, of a bygone era, and that there were these somewhat novel ideas, or these uh, kind of synergistic conclusions, concluding from practices from the medieval time period and going to especially classical Greece and Rome, and what lessons ought to be learned and what values ought to be espoused as far as a good government or a bad government. And when I say good or bad, of course, you mean it in the pragmatic sense of what type of government works well, uh, uh, depending on what the goals of that government are, and also what is a more ethically um, praiseworthy more type of government. Okay, so you're kind of looking at both with enlightened. So with enlightened, basically, right? It's anything that tries to adhere to the Enlightenment in the 1740s, obviously, such as the social contract, natural rights, checks and balances, accountability of those who are ruling, transparency, right? And so notice I'm kind of interchangeably referring to the French and the Scottish Enlightenment when I use that adjective. So anything you find in this Constitution whereby, like I said, any of those things where you find people are held accountable in certain positions, where there are checks and balances, and there's a sense of somewhat balance between different branches of the government, Those are all any cases in which people are held, there's a degree of transparency. Any of that would be considered enlightened. Okay, as far as looking at this Constitution, we'll go back to that in a minute. Conservative, just anything that is not, like conserving the status quo, conserving tradition, anything that because I acknowledge that this is even more of a nebulous adjective that I'm using for conservative than enlightened. With conservative, though, right? To me, subjectively, that's why I try to put my subjective definition here as far as examples, is to me, right, a unitary government is conservative. That has been the norm. That has been traditionally practiced throughout a myriad of civilizations in human written history, whereby a strong central government dictates laws, executes those laws, and dictates policy throughout all of its realm to every single jurisdiction, every province or state or county or village, town, etc. Right? So, at any degree to which you find this new federal government is much more powerful than the states, for instance, and the local governments, to me, that's conservative. That is nothing new. That has largely been practiced as kind of unitary practice in human history for quite some time. And because remember, right, when we tried the Confederacy, as stated in Alan Brinkley and many other books, is they contend that the United States during the War for Independence was in a somewhat, for lack of a better way of articulating it, an enlightened mood, if you will, while we were fighting against Great Britain. And so, we became much more libertarian, a deliberately very weak central government, right? And strong powers and much autonomy or independence nearly to the states and local governments. They intended that, right? Because they were libertarian. They were fearful of big government. So now when you look at this Constitution, right? Yikes, it looks like we undid that, right? With the Confederation. You're going to see a lot of powers given to this central government. And so hence, right, in many narratives, they contend that the conservatives won, as far as having polarization between libertarian liberals at that time who wanted to err on the side of too much democracy, who wanted to err on the side of having too loose of a confederation, that they lost to those who wanted to perhaps err more on the side of an aristocratic republic, right? Who wanted to err on the side of a more unitary republic, or a unitary federation, where the central government had almost perhaps too much power as opposed to the state or local governments. Okay, and so anything like that, where you see that it's there's nothing novel, there's nothing enlightened to it. I would argue that it could arguably be construed as conservative, and we'll get into some examples here soon. Pragmatic. Okay, to me, pragmatic is it's not necessarily, it doesn't adhere, at least its goal is not to adhere faithfully to any ideology of like liberalism, of classical liberalism of the 1800s, where the individual is to be his or her own boss, the government is to stay out of his or her business as much as possible, individual rights are to be protected by the government, and enumerated in a constitution, checks and balances prevail, all of that good stuff, right? Instead of trying to be liberal, or instead of trying to be conservative, mankind is a sinful mess. Government needs to be a straitjacket and control his wild inhibitions. Those of the leisurely class who have better education and more refinement and more leisure, and some even at that time had the outdated notion of essentialism, had better genes from the nobility, etc., right? That they ought to rule and they ought to have a strong central government over all the local areas, instead of trying to be liberal, as I kind of elaborated upon firstly, or conservative, what I just mentioned as the latter example. Pragmatic just simply goes for practical results, right? So any type of a compromise is, to me, pragmatic. You're not being liberal nor conservative. You're not being enlightened, right, nor archaic. You're just simply trying to bring about a practical result, right? Um, in that given situation. So let's get into some examples. I will subjectively look at some of this stuff, okay, in your Constitution, and just kind of throw it out as far as food for thought. When I see Article 1, I see that House representatives are chosen or elected by the citizenry, and that only for 2 years. That seems pretty enlightened, considering the poor representation of the House of Commons back in England, the weakness of Parliament and still in some of the European governments, the tendency to go to the far left or the far right, especially the latter in Latin America, that's coming in the early 1800s when they break free from Spain. And so looking at a strong House of Representatives that's popularly elected, they have to be an inhabitant of that state, right? So they have to be held accountable by their constituents and know what it's like to live there, right? They're only can run for 2 years and then they have to run again. So there's a good sort of accountability. All laws that extract wealth, that tax us, have to originate in the House of Representatives. That's also enlightened, right? No taxation without representation. The elected reps are the ones who ought to choose to tax us, right? And so those are all examples, perhaps of enlightened. Also notice right later on that there is to be under Section 9 of Article, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but is it of Article 1? Yes, of Article 1 of Section 9, there's to be no nobility, right? So we're not going to have an established nobility as England had, right? And so notice also that it says here under Section 5, each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings and from time to time publish it, right? The yeas and nays shall be entered onto the journal. So transparency, right? So that we see what our elected reps are up to, what's going on in the meetings, who's voting for what, etc., right? All of that, to me, subjectively, is enlightened. Okay, the fact that they have the right to impeach the president, right? To accuse the president of a high crime, misdemeanor, treason, bribery, etc., of breaking a federal law, and to have him possibly be removed. That would be an example of checks and balances, right? So all of that which I just mentioned, I would argue under Article 1 with the House of Representatives is perhaps enlightened, at least for the 1780s. Okay. Then also with the Senate, the fact that the senators, right, are not popularly elected, but they're chosen by the state legislators. Okay, so that's one step removed from representative democracy, right? Because the state legislators are popularly elected, but they are the ones that elect the senators. They have longer terms. Okay, so that's all seems to be more conservative, right? But you might make the argument that there needs to be a system of checks and balances, that you don't simply want the will of the majority to prevail in all cases. I mean, look at subsequent history after this, right? Slavery is going to be popularly embraced. The Jim Crow laws of the South are going to be popularly embraced. The disenfranchisement of women is going to be popularly acceptable and accepted, right? So sometimes the masses get things wrong. And so the senators, right, you could say that that's a great system of checks and balances, like Rome, that Montesquieu had written in the Enlightenment, right? That too much democracy is a bad thing as well. There needs to be checks and balances. And so hence, right, there needs to be elements of democracy, but also elements of aristocracy, and to have a check on one another. So hence, when you look at Rome, you didn't just have the tribunes of Rome, the elected tribunes running the show. After all, you could look at the Gracchus brothers and other cases of the tribunes getting a little bit out of control and starting class warfare and different volatile issues in Rome's history. But the Senate, right, sometimes could be a voice of reason, a pedal of restraint on the will of the tribunes back in Rome's Republic. So the same thing. Now we have senators that might sometimes need to put a check on the popular House of Representatives, right? The fact that the Senate has to okay treaties made by the president, has to give their approval to the cabinet members that are chosen by the president. The fact that they, and as well as the House, both can not only um, pass a law by simple majority and hand it over to the president. But if the president says no and vetoes it, right, with a 2/3 supermajority, they could override his or her veto. So, and then of course the Senate tries the president should he or she be impeached by the House. So hence checks and balances. So look what I'm doing now is I'm looking for examples, right, of enlightened components to the Constitution. All right. Let's see here. Uh, Also looking at this, I think of, with the president and the system of checks and balances, again, he or she has to approve of legislation, can veto it, but yet again, they can override by way of a supermajority, his or her veto. The president, right, is not allowed to build an army, is not allowed to, except in the case of an insurrection or an invasion, cannot requisition the state militias. But if the Congress first raises the army and declares war, then he or she becomes commander in chief of the armed forces. So hence checks and balances, right? And in light of like Montesquieu's writing and the Enlightenment, the president shall give information in section 3 of Article 2 to Congress and keep them apprised of what he or she is up to, and also give them recommendations as far as what he or she thinks they ought to consider for legislation. That is kind of in the system, in the spirit of checks and balances, you might say, because notice it's not coercive power, but it's cooperation and balance of powers, right? Then you look at things like the Constitution, Article 6, right? Article 6, it says, this Constitution, shall be the supreme law of the land. Then you go back behind that, right? And you look at under Article 2 in Section 1, it says, before the president enters the execution of his or her office, he or she shall take the following oath or affirmation. And of course, it is swearing fidelity to the Constitution. So that's enlightened also, right? That no one will have arbitrary power to do as he or she pleases as far as the federal positions of this federal republic, but be held accountable by this enlightened written document, the Constitution. All right. So to me, all those might be examples that you could find of enlightened elements to our Constitution. And I'm just using the first 2 articles. Needless to say, when you look at the amendments, any or all of the amendments can be used as examples of an enlightened component. The First Amendment, right? Freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom to peacefully protest, right? The right to bear arms. Quite a few of them pertain to our due process, right? The right to your person and property without improper searches and seizures that must be first warranted upon probable cause. The fact that you can counter examine your hostile witnesses and have an attorney present for you, that you shall not be forced to indict yourself, right? There shall be no cruel and unusual punishment. You shall have right a trial by jury. It says under Article 3, all cases with the exception of impeachments shall be tried by a jury, et cetera, et cetera. So conservative, all right? One of the first things I think of, right off the bat in Article 1 is in determining the number of House of Reps. First of all, it says, right, it shall not exceed 1 rep for every 30,000 civilians. 1 voice for 30,000 civilians? That's not that democratic, okay? Then secondly, who are the citizens? According to the Enlightenment, there should be universal citizenship for all human beings. It should be that simple. But of course, that wasn't the case, right? The founding fathers were too cowardly, too conservative, too traditional, too ethno and Eurocentric to engage in that bold step. So what do they allow? They allow each state to decide on citizenship. So that's very old school and conservative. There's nothing enlightened about that, right? And then it states, right, that when you're counting the reps, it excludes, it doesn't count Indians not taxed. So Native Americans are treated as a separate nation under the federal government, right? So there's nothing in here as far as, integration for Native Americans, but the tribes are to be treated as separate from the Republic. And also 3/5 of other persons, and we all know what that is, a 3/5 compromise, that's slaves. So we're okay with slavery, right? Clearly that's conservative. Or you might even say, sadly, that it's pragmatic, that it was a pragmatic compromise with the southern states to get them to get the 9 states we needed out of the 13 to approve of this constitution, that they made that pragmatic, immoral or amoral compromise with slavery. So that's not very democratic as far as slavery goes, right? You look at Section 9 under Article 1, and it says that basically the slave trade cannot be stopped until at least 1808. And they basically put a gag rule on it. So the congressman couldn't even determine anything definitively about the slave trade until 1808. They gave it a 20-year gag rule where no one could even bring it up in Congress, much less do anything about it, right? So you find that there. And then, of course, you fast forward to Article 4, Section 2, and it says anybody under contract who runs away shall be brought back under that contract. It's a fugitive slave law, right? They try to be very euphemistic about it. They never use the word slave, right, or anything like that. But they're just, it's like saying pass away instead of die. It's just a kinder, way of articulating an ugly truth. So you have a fugitive slave law there, right? Then also notice conservatively, Article 6, all debts contracted shall be valid. So, of course, right, a lot of the wealthy founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention who had money owed them, they wanted to make sure that they got their money back, right? So those are all examples, I would argue, subjectively, of the Constitution being rather conservative. And then another one I would say is Article 1, Section 8. This has a list of what Congress can do. When you compare it to the Articles of Confederation, this is a much stronger central government than before, right? Because remember, under the Confederation, it was libertarian in foundation. They wanted deliberately a weak central government. Now you look at Article 1, Section 8, we have a much stronger federal or central government, okay? Borrow money, regulate trade, make laws on bankruptcies, naturalization, to coin money, print money, do issue standards of weights and measures, punish counterfeiting and piracy, the post office, any courts inferior to the Supreme Court, declare war, raise an army, put down insurrections or repel invasions, right? And then look at the bottom, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. To some people, right, this elastic clause is like a blank check that's saying, by the way, after this long list of enumerated powers that Congress has, if there's something on here that we can't find on this list, but we want to employ as a federal power in the future, we reserve the right to do it by claiming that it's necessary and proper to do such, right? And we're going to get into that argument with the first Bank of the United States, and how this scared the heck out of libertarians when Hamilton and others advocated this, that they were arguably stretching the power of the central government to their utmost effort. All right. So again, to me, those are all considered, you might consider conservative components to the Constitution. All right. Remember how Congress was to keep a journal and let from time to time publish it so that the constituents could see what their congressmen were up to? It says, however, accepting such parts as may in their judgment require secrecy. So they could keep it secret as well, right? And then again, ultimately with conservative, you have House reps, you have senators, right? And doubly constituting the legislature. Then you have the president, vice president, and cabinet all in one. Well, let's put them all together as the executive. There's 3. Then you have the Supreme Court. There's 4. How many of those 4 are directly elected by the citizens. And remember, that's just those who are declared citizens by the states. So not sorry women, New York and New Jersey flirted with that idea and then rescinded on it. Sorry African Americans, just a few are going to give limited rights to some African Americans in the North, right? So again, going back to the four, how many are directly elected by their constituents, by the citizens? Only the House reps, 1 out of 4. That is not a very democratic republic, okay? So remember, we have a constitutional federal republic. Constitution is to be the law of the land. It is our source of accountability. By supposedly the social contract, we gave our consent to this Constitution through the ratification process. So it's ultimately the law of the land. The federal part is a balance between a confederation, where the states are almost autonomous, and a unitary government, when the central government is supreme. We have a federation, a federal republic, where there's a balance, right? Where only Congress can do certain things under like Article 1, Section 8. But the 10th Amendment says whatever is not explicitly given to the federal government is reserved to the states. So nothing is spoken of about police powers, education, etc. So those arguably are state issues. All right. So we have a constitutional, federal, and then republic is like Rome, right? What Aristotle kind of vaguely just hinted was a mixed government. There are elements to it which are democratic, elements to which it is aristocratic, and elements to which it is monarchical and has one chief strong executive, although Rome had 2. All right. And then pragmatic. Like I said, I think you could definitely put under pragmatic many of the examples found in Article 1, Section 8. Okay. The fact that we need to have a system of weights and measures, regulate interstate trade, have a system as far as inventions, as far as naturalization of immigrants, the need to be able to raise an army in case there's an insurrection or an invasion of the country. Are those just practical necessities, right? That our founding fathers pragmatically devised. Any of the system of checks and balances, you might argue, is pragmatic, is practical in nature. Again, because pragmatic to me is amoral. You're not worried about adhering to an ideology, nor are you even worried about adhering to a particular ethic, but you're just simply doing what yields the best practical results. I would say that amorally, slavery and our compromises with slavery could be considered a pragmatic decision by the founding fathers. So again, notice how I said, especially between the second and third categories of conservative and pragmatic, how I've mentioned the same thing in both of those categories as a possible example. What I ask you to do, because I wouldn't go so far as say that, go to the extreme of relativism, where I think that any answer is as good as any other, as far as what you put into what category. To me, it has to make sense, right? So there are such things as wrong answers or inaccurate or illogical answers. However, is there a degree to which several components in here could be considered under at least 2 of the 3 categories? Absolutely. So that's why I ask you to just simply, even just in one sentence, to briefly defend why you put that section as conservative, why you put that section as pragmatic or as enlightened. Okay. And I literally, with me, one sentence is okay. It doesn't have to be, expansive at all, but just briefly defend your decision. Okay. And remember, I'm only asking you to have at least something from the first 3 articles in any of the one of the 3 categories. And I'm asking for at least 4 examples under each of the 3 categories. And then lastly, I'm asking for you to briefly defend each example as to why it's conservative, why it's enlightened, or why it's pragmatic in your estimation. All right. And so technically, you don't need another source besides just looking, at my subjective definitions for these 3 categories and the Constitution itself. All right. Are there any questions or comments? want to make sure everyone gets credit here because I notice I have a couple other names that I had not originally written down. All right. So let's see here. Sorry, I want to make sure I have everyone. All right. So I believe I have all the names. Can I get a thumbs up from anybody to verify that you guys are still with me? You guys get this? Thank you, Allie. Thank you very much. All right. Okay, guys. So again, same as usual. If you have any questions, just Canvas message me. All right. And I will have this posted as soon as I can. Thank you, Matthew. All right. And you guys, good luck with this. I'm sure you'll do fine. So like I said, just 4 examples in each of the 3 categories, at least one example from each, at least one single section from all 3 of the first 3 articles found in any one of the 3 categories, and just a very brief defense as to why you believe that component is conservative, enlightened, or pragmatic. All right, you guys can do great, okay? Thank you for being here. You'll get your extra credit points that you have certainly earned, and have a good day, okay? And I'll see you on Wednesday.